Okay, so today we're really diving deep
Yeah.
into a region that's just packed with history and strategic importance. The Karakorams and the Aksai Chin.
Right.
To really understand this area, we're going way back in time, back to the 19th century,
Right.
and we're looking at the Great Game.
Yeah, the Great Game.
At rivalry between Great Britain and Russia.
Yeah, if you want to understand like why this part of the world is the way it is today,
Yeah,
the Great Game is essential.
totally.
We've gone through a ton of historical sources
Yeah.
to try to give you a really clear and engaging picture of just what was going on back then.
Yeah, so no extra details, just the stuff that's important.
Yeah, just the need to know stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to break down these huge historical forces and reveal some like surprising connections you might not have thought of.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we want to give you a solid understanding of how this strategically vital territory
Right.
took shape.
We're looking at the historical records in our sources. So this isn't just speculation or anything.
No.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Yeah, let's unpack this.
What was this Great Game all about?
Okay, so at its heart,
Yeah.
the Great Game was a 19th century geopolitical competition, basically a clash of empires between Britain and Russia, and they were competing for control of Central Asia.
Okay, so you've got these two massive powers
Right.
maneuvering for influence across this huge part of the world.
Exactly.
So what were the stakes for each of them?
Yeah.
What were their worries?
For Britain,
Yeah,
their biggest worry was the security of India.
right.
India was like the crown jewel of their empire.
Yeah.
And they were terrified of Russia invading through their northwestern frontiers. That anxiety, that fear, it really shaped their policies in that whole region.
Okay, so India was like everything to them.
It was everything.
Got it.
Yeah.
So what about Russia?
What were they doing pushing south and east?
Well, Russia had a lot of motivations.
Okay.
Obviously, they wanted to expand their empire.
Yeah.
They wanted power. They wanted to look important. But they also had commercial ambitions.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they wanted to make money.
Yeah.
And they wanted to gain military power in that region.
Right.
They saw Persia, Afghanistan,
Yeah.
even parts of China
Right.
as places where they could increase their influence.
So both sides were suspicious.
Oh, absolutely.
Like constantly,
yeah.
always thinking the other one was about to make a move.
Mm-hmm.
That must have been tense.
It was incredibly tense.
Yeah.
That atmosphere of suspicion,
Yeah.
it really colored how they interpreted each other's actions.
Right.
And more importantly for us,
Yeah.
it affected how they started to draw borders.
Okay.
Borders became a way to manage this perceived threat.
Wow.
Yeah. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's talk about some key moments where this rivalry got really heated,
Right.
like the Penjdeh crisis of 1885.
Okay.
What happened there?
1885, right? Russian forces moved into the Penjdeh Oasis,
Right.
and Britain considered that part of Afghanistan.
They did.
That must have freaked out London.
It did.
Yeah.
It caused a major war scare in Britain
Oh, wow.
because it confirmed their worst fears about India's vulnerability. The British felt surrounded
Yeah.
Russia to the south.
Right.
They were worried about France.
Yeah.
They were even keeping an eye on China.
Wow.
And on top of that,
Yeah.
Russia had been expanding its territory in Central Asia for years before this.
Okay, so back up a little bit.
Yeah.
What had Russia been doing?
Throughout the 1860s and 70s,
Okay.
Russia had been steadily expanding.
Mm-hmm.
They took the Caucasus,
Right.
the Uzbek Khanis,
Okay.
like Bukhara and Kokand
Yeah.
and Turkmenistan.
Mm-hmm.
So taking Penjdeh
Yeah.
seemed like the next logical step. They were getting closer and closer to Afghanistan.
And Britain saw Afghanistan as a buffer.
Exactly.
Protecting India.
Protecting India.
Right.
And what's really amazing is this small territorial dispute revealed how anxious Britain was about its empire.
Wow.
And it shifted their thinking
Okay.
from being defensive to being expansionist.
So this wasn't just about a piece of land.
Yeah.
It was about their whole empire.
It was about the perceived vulnerability of the entire British Empire.
So what
Yeah.
happened?
Okay,
Did they go to war?
they almost did.
Wow.
Britain got its troops ready in India.
Yeah.
And their navy was on high alert in the Pacific.
Yeah.
It was a really tense time.
Yeah.
But they avoided war.
Wow.
Diplomacy.
Okay.
Queen Victoria actually played a big role in calming things down.
Wow.
By 1887, they had the Anglo-Russian Joint Afghan Boundary Commission.
Okay.
They worked out a deal.
And?
Russia kept Pentache,
Okay.
but Afghanistan got the Zulfikar Pass, which blocked Russia from advancing towards Herat.
Got it. So close call.
Very close.
And it sounds like it pushed Britain to become more aggressive.
Yeah, it definitely did.
Okay.
They adopted what they called a forward policy.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of waiting for Russia to maybe reach the Indus River,
Right.
they started expanding their control westward
Okay.
so they could meet any threat from Russia closer to India.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and this led to the Durand Line in 1893.
The Durand Line,
Yes,
a border that's still so important today.
absolutely.
Why did they create that?
Okay, so the Durand Line,
Yeah.
it wasn't just about marking territory.
Okay.
Britain wanted to create a buffer zone
Right.
of friendly tribes,
Okay.
or at least tribes that they controlled.
So they could control the area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This would make it harder for Russia to invade.
Makes sense.
The goal was to split up the Pashtun tribes
Okay.
and stop Russia from influencing them.
Got it.
They also wanted to control places like Chitral and Gilgit, even though those were hard to get to.
Yeah.
And the locals weren't always happy about it.
Right. Okay. So Penja was one flashpoint.
Right.
What about the Pamir confrontation in 1891?
Oh, yeah, that was another tense one.
What happened there?
In 1891,
Okay.
Russian forces moved into the Pamir Mountains.
Mm-hmm.
They even kicked out British officers like Francis Younghusband.
Wow. So they were not messing around.
They were not.
Okay. And how did Britain react?
They were worried
Yeah.
because they saw it as a threat to Kashmir.
Right.
So they sent military expeditions
Mm-hmm.
to places like Hunzanagar and Chitral.
Okay.
They wanted to secure those mountain passes and valleys.
So more military action.
Yeah, they had to show force.
And what happened?
Eventually, they reached an agreement in 1895,
Okay.
the Pamir Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
This agreement gave the Pamir region to Afghanistan.
Right.
So basically, they created another buffer zone
To separate them.
to separate the British and the Russians.
So Afghanistan was stuck in the middle of all this.
You could say that Afghanistan was independent in name only.
Yeah.
Their foreign policy was heavily influenced by this rivalry.
By Britain and Russia?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's interesting how many agreements were about creating distance.
Right. Just keeping these two apart.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just land borders, was it?
No, it wasn't.
What about Persia and the Persian Gulf?
Yeah. Russia's influence in Persia was growing,
Okay.
especially after they built the Trans-Caspian Railway in the 1880s.
Mm-hmm.
This worried Britain
Yeah.
because they had a lot of business interests in southern Persia,
Right.
and they controlled the Persian Gulf.
Okay.
Lord Curzon,
Yeah.
he was a big deal in British politics.
Mm-hmm.
He even warned about Russia setting up a naval base in the Persian Gulf.
Oh, wow.
Britain saw that as a huge threat.
Because of the trade routes to India.
Exactly.
Right.
They were worried about their access to India.
They called the Persian Gulf a British protectorate.
That's right.
That sounds serious.
It was. They really wanted to dominate the region,
Mm.
but Russia kept trying to mess with their plans in Persia.
Like what?
Well, they tried to block the Reuter concession.
What was that?
That was a British project
Okay.
to build railroads and develop resources in Persia.
So Russia didn't want them to do that.
No, they didn't.
Okay. And then there's the Second Anglo-Afghan War.
Right.
How does that fit in?
That war ended with the Treaty of Gandamak in 1879.
Okay.
This treaty made sure that Afghanistan was in Britain's sphere of influence.
So they wanted Afghanistan as a buffer state.
Yes,
Okay.
they wanted to keep Russia away from India.
It makes sense.
But even after that,
Yeah.
Britain was still suspicious of Russia.
Like, what were they suspicious of?
Well, things like the Russian diplomatic mission to Kabul in 1878.
Okay.
They were worried about a secret alliance.
Between Russia and Afghanistan.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a complicated situation.
So this great game wasn't just about Central Asia.
No, it wasn't.
It was global.
Yeah, it affected everything.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, Britain's occupation of Port Hamilton in Korea,
Mm-hmm.
that was because of Russian ambitions in the Pacific.
Oh, wow.
And their relationship with China
Yeah.
was also affected.
How so?
Well, Russia had gained territory in Xinjiang after the Ili crisis.
Yeah, right.
And then there's Persia.
Yeah.
Britain and Russia were always competing there
For influence.
for influence.
Got it.
Britain was always afraid of Russia.
Yeah.
They thought Russia was always trying to undermine them.
Whether it was India or just generally.
Right, they felt like they had to be on guard all the time.
So you had Russia building the Trans-Caspian Railway and Britain with their navy and their forward policy.
Exactly.
It was a huge
A
rivalry.
huge and complex rivalry.
Okay, so this great game sets the stage for so much.
It does.
Let's talk about the Treaty of Amritsar in 1846.
Okay.
How does that fit in?
The Treaty of Amritsar. It happened after the First Anglo-Sikh War. It was a really important moment for Britain's empire.
Okay.
Especially because of the Great Game.
Right.
Basically, Britain defeated the Sikh Empire. And then they sold Kashmir to Gulab Singh.
Who was that?
He was a powerful Dogra leader.
Okay.
This sale created the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Under British control.
Well, under British suzerainty.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means Jammu and Kashmir had its own ruler.
Okay.
And its own government. But their foreign policy and their ultimate loyalty was to the British crown.
So they weren't completely independent?
No, they weren't.
Okay.
They had some freedom, but they were still under British influence.
That's interesting. They sold a whole territory.
It did.
Why would they do that?
It was a strategic move.
Okay, how so?
They wanted to create a buffer state.
Between them and Russia?
Exactly.
Okay.
Jammu and Kashmir would protect British India from the north.
So it was all about the Great Game?
Yeah, it was all about protecting their interests.
So it wasn't about the money?
No, it's just 75 lakh rupees.
Yeah.
It's just a small part of it.
The main reason was to keep Russia away?
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, the treaty, which they signed in March of 1846, made Gulab Singh the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir.
In exchange for that money?
Right.
But this treaty was different.
Yeah, how so?
It didn't say anything about a British resident?
You were right.
Or direct political control?
It didn't.
Why not?
Well, there was some trust in Gulab Singh.
Okay.
He had helped them in the war against the Sikhs.
Right.
But they also wanted to create a semi-independent buffer state.
Instead of directly controlling it.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
It was a way to manage that difficult territory.
But that didn't last forever, did it?
No, it didn't.
Okay, so what happened?
As the 19th century went on and the Great Game intensified, Britain got more and more worried about Russia. So they started putting pressure on Gulab Singh's successors.
Who were they?
Ranbir Singh and Pratap Singh.
Okay.
They wanted them to accept more British control.
So they were going back on the treaty?
Well, not explicitly.
Okay.
But their priorities had changed.
Right. They needed to secure that frontier.
Exactly.
So what about the people of Jammu and Kashmir?
Unfortunately, their interests weren't really a priority.
For Britain, it was all about the empire.
It was about protecting British India.
That's sad.
It is.
Okay. So the British wanted control.
They did.
And the Srinagar Valley was part of that?
It was a strategically important area.
Right.
But it was also beautiful. It attracted British settlers.
Yeah.
And it became a symbol of their power.
So how did the Dogra rulers react to all this?
At first, they resisted.
Okay.
They tried to use the treaty to stay independent. Ranbir Singh.
Yeah.
He really tried to keep control of his own affairs.
Yeah.
But by the time Pratap Singh came to power, the pressure from Britain was too much.
Yeah.
They had the military, the money. It was hard to fight back.
So what happened?
In 1889, Britain basically forced a British resident on them.
What does that mean?
It means they put a British official in charge of things.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So Jammu and Kashmir lost its special status.
It did.
It became like the other princely states.
Yes.
Under British control.
Under British control.
Okay, so Jammu and Kashmir becomes part of this buffer strategy.
Right.
Let's talk about Gilgit Baltistan.
Okay.
Why was that area so important?
Gilgit was crucial because of its location.
Okay.
It's beyond the upper Indus River, near the headwaters of the Swat River.
Right.
It was a key part of the northwestern frontier.
And when did Britain get interested in it?
Their interest really grew after the 1870s.
Okay.
And they established the Gilgit Agency in 1889.
What was that for?
It was to keep an eye on Russia. They wanted to see if Russia was moving across the Pamir Mountains.
Right.
And they also wanted to control the trade routes to Central Asia.
So it was all about strategy.
Yeah, but what's fascinating is that this region has a really ancient history.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Tell me more.
Okay, so this area was home to the Dardic people.
Oh, okay.
And they go way back.
Like how far back?
Even ancient geographers like Ptolemy knew about them.
Wow.
He mentioned them living west of the Indus and north of Gandhara.
Okay.
Their languages are super interesting.
How?
They're a mix of Iranian and Sanskritic influences.
Wow.
They show how much interaction there was across the mountains.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so this wasn't just some empty land.
Right.
It was a place with its own history and culture.
Long before the British and the Russians.
Exactly.
It really changes how you see the Great Game.
It does.
So it wasn't just about those two empires. It was something there before them.
There was.
And what about those Chinese Buddhist pilgrims?
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned them earlier.
Yeah, Fossian and Xuanzang.
Mm-hmm.
They traveled through this region centuries ago,
Mm-hmm.
and they wrote about a really vibrant Buddhist culture in Gilgit.
Oh, wow.
They talked about monasteries and stupas.
So Gilgit was a major center.
It was a major connection point
Yeah.
between India, Central Asia, and China.
It's amazing how much history is there.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about the Great Game.
Right.
Now let's talk about the Dogra dynasty.
Okay.
How did they come to control all this?
All right, so it starts with Raja Ranjit Dev.
Okay.
He came to power in the mid-18th century.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, the Mughal Empire was weakening.
Right.
So regional powers like the Dogras,
Yeah.
they could become more independent.
Got it.
Ranjit Dev,
Yeah.
he was a smart guy.
Okay.
He had a rivalry with Raja Kirpal Dev of Jasrota,
Mm-hmm.
but he also allied with the Mughals in Delhi.
So he was playing both sides.
He was a good strategist.
Yeah.
He wanted to increase his power.
And he expanded his territory, too.
Yeah, he moved towards Sialkot.
Okay.
But when he died in 1780,
Mm-hmm.
the region became vulnerable to the Sikhs.
Right, they were getting more powerful.
Exactly.
Okay, so then what?
Then we have the next generation of Dogras,
Who were they?
Gulab Singh,
Mm-hmm.
Dhyan Singh,
Yeah.
and Sushet Singh.
Okay.
They were the great-grandsons of Mian Surat Singh.
Got it.
And they changed everything for the Dogras.
How so?
They joined forces with Maharaja Ranjit Singh.
The Sikh ruler.
Yeah, he was the one who united Punjab.
Right.
They became important soldiers and administrators.
Okay.
They were skilled in both war and politics.
So they were rising in the ranks.
They were.
Okay.
And then in 1822,
Yeah.
Ranjit Singh made Gulab Singh the Raja of Jammu.
So the Dogras were back in power,
They were.
but they were still under the Sikhs. And what about his brothers?
Ranjit Singh gave them land grants, too.
So they were all powerful.
They were a powerful family.
Okay. So how did Gulab Singh create his own empire?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
When Maharaja Ranjit Singh died in 1839,
Mm-hmm.
the Sikh empire started to fall apart.
Okay.
Gulab Singh was really clever during this time.
How so?
He stayed neutral.
During the war with the British.
Yeah, the first Anglo-Sikh war.
Mm-hmm.
This made him look good to the British.
I see.
So when they won the war,
Yeah.
they decided to sell him Kashmir.
In the Treaty of Amritsar.
That's right.
So he combined his own lands with Kashmir.
Exactly.
And created Jammu and Kashmir.
That's how it happened.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story.
And then there's General Zorawar Singh.
Right?
He was a key figure in expanding the Dogra realm.
Absolutely.
Tell me about his conquests.
Okay, so first,
Yeah.
there was Ladakh.
Mm-hmm.
He conquered Ladakh in 1834.
Ladakh was a Buddhist kingdom, right?
Yes, high in the Himalayas.
Okay.
Ladakh was already weak,
It's from
internal problems and pressure from outside. So Zorawar Singh's forces were able to take over.
They were good at fighting in the mountains.
They were experts.
Mm-hmm.
By 1836, they had defeated the Ladakhi rulers,
Wow.
and this opened up trade routes to Central Asia.
So it was a strategic victory.
It was.
Okay, and then what?
Then he turned his attention to Gilgit Baltistan,
Mm-hmm.
places like Skardu,
Yeah.
Gilgit itself,
Right.
and the Hunza Valley.
Okay.
Between 1839 and 1840,
Mm-hmm.
he brought these areas under Dogra control.
So he was securing their northern border,
Exactly.
and then he invaded Tibet.
He did.
That was ambitious.
So it was a bold move. He
Yeah.
invaded in 1841,
Okay.
and he actually got pretty far.
How far?
He captured Rudak and Gartok,
Mhm.
and he even reached the Mansarovar Lake area.
Wow.
But then winter came,
Oh, no.
and it was brutal.
Right.
His troops were exhausted,
Yeah.
and they didn't have enough supplies.
That's rough.
They were
you go
attacked
Tibetan.
Tibetan and Chinese forces,
Oh, wow.
and Zorawar Singh was killed in battle.
That's tragic.
It
When
went
did this happen?
December 12, 1841.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he was a great general,
He was.
but he overreached.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, so you mentioned the Sikhs being in Gilgit before.
I did.
Tell me more about that.
Okay, so in the early 1800s,
Mm-hmm.
Maharaja Ranjit Singh was expanding his empire.
Yeah.
He sent a small garrison to Gilgit.
Why?
He wanted to control the trade routes
Okay.
and stop the Afghans from gaining influence.
Right.
But their control wasn't very strong.
Okay.
The local rulers kept challenging them.
So it was unstable.
It was.
And then Ranjit Singh died.
Right.
And the Sikh empire fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
So when the British won the Second Anglo-Sikh War,
Yes.
they gave Gilgit to Gulab Singh
Along with Kashmir.
as part of the Treaty of Amritsar.
Exactly.
But it wasn't a simple handover, was it?
No, it wasn't.
The terrain was difficult.
Right.
And there were local tribes who resisted. So they had to create a boundary commission.
Yeah, they had to figure out where the borders were.
So the Great Game in the Dogra dynasty, they created this complex situation.
They did.
That we still see today.
Yeah, the Karakorams and Aksai Chin.
It's fascinating.
It is.
It's like this legacy of empire
It is.
that's still playing out.
Absolutely.
So we've seen how this rivalry between Britain and Russia shaped Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit Baltistan.
It had a huge impact.
It's incredible how these events from the 1800s are still relevant today.
They are.
This deep dive has really helped me understand the complexities of this region.
Me too.
It's like looking through a historical lens to see how we got here.
Exactly.
So all this history of empires fighting for control, what does it mean for the future?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
What challenges does this legacy create?
For stability and development, it's something to think about.
It is something to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really is.
It is.
Have you ever looked at a map and really thought about the borders, what went into making them? They're not just lines, right?
Right.
Each one has this huge story behind it. And sometimes it's a messy story.
Often messy, yeah.
Today we're diving into one of those stories, one that still has a real impact on the world today, even though it started, quite a while ago.
Definitely.
We're talking about the Great Game, British anxieties about their empire, and how all of that connects to the situation in Aksai Chin today.
It's a fascinating case, and it shows how something that might seem like ancient history can still have a huge impact on the relationships between countries today, like with India and China. You can't really understand what's going on there without understanding this background.
Totally. And, when you pull together all the sources for this deep dive, historical accounts, strategic analyses, even hints of Cold War espionage,
that's all fair.
It became clear that there's a lot to unpack here.
Yep.
So to lay it all out, we're going to try to figure out the strategic thinking and, honestly, the betrayals that ended up creating the Aksai Chin situation today.
Yeah.
We're going to trace it all back from those imperial rivalries in the 19th century through the Cold War to see how they all come together in this territorial dispute that's still going on.
I'm ready.
So to kick things off, let's go back to the late 1800s. Why were the British so interested in Gilgit in the first place? What was so special about it? It wasn't just the mountain views, right?
Definitely not just the scenery. The British were really worried about the Russian Empire. They saw the Russians expanding their influence, getting closer and closer to India, first into the Pamirs, and then they were worried about the Germans getting into Afghanistan.
Oh, wow.
So for the British, holding onto their Indian empire meant securing that whole northwest frontier, and Gilgit was right in the middle of it.
Right, so that's where Jammu and Kashmir come in, right?
Exactly. The British started tightening their grip on that whole region. That's right. If you look at the bigger picture, their control over Jammu and Kashmir, which of course includes Gilgit, was all about protecting that northwest frontier. It all started with the Treaty of Amritsar. On the surface, it was setting up the Dogra dynasty to rule there.
Okay.
But, and this is important, there were some parts of the treaty that weren't so clear. And the British, they used those ambiguities to their advantage. Over time, they basically integrated the whole region into their imperial defense system.
So they were playing the long game.
They were.
And what about the Dogra rulers themselves?
Guys like Ranbir Singh and then his son, Pratap Singh, they were caught in a tough spot. They wanted to keep their power, obviously.
Yeah.
But the British were increasingly calling the shots.
So their authority was getting chipped away.
That's a good way to put it.
And Gilgit became this focal point, right?
It did.
With the Gilgit Agency. Tell me about that.
Sure. So the British, they first set up a political agent in Gilgit back in 1877.
Oh, that early.
Yeah, pretty early. It shows how concerned they were about the Russians, even back then. This was at the peak of the Great Game.
Right. For our listeners who aren't familiar, the Great Game was this intense rivalry between the British and the Russians.
Exactly, for control over Central Asia.
But they pulled out of Gilgit in 1881. Why was that?
It's not totally clear. Maybe logistics were tough, or maybe they shifted their focus for a bit, but they definitely didn't forget about the Russians.
No.
So in 1889, they went back and reestablished the Gilgit Agency, this time for good. And this was a much bigger deal.
Okay.
They staffed it entirely with British officers, which basically sidelined the Dogra administration there. And Gilgit was just so strategically important. It was like a crossroads for routes leading to the Pamirs and Chinese Turkestan. Perfect spot to keep an eye on the Russians.
Like a front row seat to the Great Game.
Exactly.
So then we get to the 1935 lease agreement. That sounds like a real power move.
It was. By the 1930s, the Great Game had changed. Now, the Soviets were the main concern, not the Tsar. And there were those early signs of, well, German ambitions too.
Right.
The British felt like they needed even more control over Gilgit. So they basically forced Maharaja Hari Singh of Jammu and Kashmir to lease a huge chunk of the Gilgit region to British India. And this wasn't just any old land. We're talking Gilgit Town, most of the Gilgit Agency, and key areas like Hunza, Nagar, Yassin, Ishkaman.
Wow.
A 60-year lease.
That's a long time.
It was. And it meant the British were directly in charge now. Hari Singh, he'd taken over from Pratap Singh back in 25, but he was in a weak position.
Oh, how so?
Jammu and Kashmir really depended on the British for military and financial support, so he couldn't really say no to them.
They basically took over.
They did. The leased area, they often called it the Gilgit Agency proper, became a part of British India in all but name, run by a British political agent. At first, this agent reported to the resident in Kashmir, but later, it was the British agent in Peshawar.
Really?
Shows you how Gilgit was getting tied more and more to the northwest frontier province's security.
Okay, so the British are firmly in control in Gilgit. Now, our sources talk about a British double-cross at this point. What exactly happened?
This is where the story takes a real turn. It starts with the Gilgit Scouts.
Who were they?
A local force. They were first set up in 1913, but the British really expanded them after they got that lease in 35.
Oh, interesting.
And here's the key. These scouts, they were recruited from the local tribes, mostly Muslim, like the Shins and Yashkins, and they were trained and led by British officers. Their funding, straight from Delhi, the Maharaja's own troops, not allowed anywhere near this region.
So the British were building up their own little army.
They were. Loyal to them, not the Maharaja. It was a brilliant, if maybe not so ethical way to secure their influence.
A shadow army within the Maharaja's own territory.
Exactly. And it's going to play a big role in what's coming next.
1947, India gets its independence. What happens to those leased territories?
So as independence got closer, Delhi decided, okay, we'll give those territories back to the Maharaja.
That's a good gesture.
It was supposed to be, symbolically restoring his sovereignty. The handover was set for August 1st, 47, right before the big day on August 15th.
Okay.
But things were really tense on the ground.
Right.
Remember, most people in Gilgit were Muslim, and they weren't thrilled about being ruled by a Hindu Maharaja.
Right.
And there were rumors flying around that Jammu and Kashmir might join India. Turns out those rumors were true.
So a lot of uncertainty.
A lot. And that's when things get really interesting with the Gilgit Scouts.
What did they do?
Well, Major William Brown, a British officer commanding the Scouts, he decided to take matters into his own hands.
Cool.
On October 31st, 47, his scouts surrounded the governor's residence in Gilgit.
Wow.
It was quick, no bloodshed, really. The governor, Ghansara Singh, was out, detained. The next day, the Pakistani flag was up in Gilgit. They declared a provisional government.
So the Scouts just took over?
Pretty much. Led by Brown and some local leaders, the Mirs of Hunza and Nagar. And here's the crucial part. On November 2nd, Brown sends a message to Peshawar, which was now in Pakistan.
What did he say?
Come and take over. He basically asked Pakistan to run the place.
And did they?
They did. By November 16th, a Pakistani political agent, Khan Muhammad Alam Khan, he arrives in Gilgit. Pakistani control was official.
Wow, so that's how it happened.
Yeah, Ghansara Singh, the governor, he stayed under arrest until 48 when they finally let him go and handed him back to India.
That's quite a story. A British officer leading a force loyal to Britain basically hands over a chunk of territory to Pakistan, and the Maharaja is just pushed aside.
It's a pretty clear example of how the big powers, even when they're on their way out, they still look after their own interests.
Definitely. So what was behind this double cross? Why would the British want Pakistan in charge?
Good question. There are a few theories. First, some in the British establishment actually liked the idea of a separate Muslim state, so they were kind of sympathetic to Pakistan from the get-go.
Right.
But more importantly, strategically, they still wanted to keep an eye on the Soviets, especially their nuclear program.
Uh-huh.
And Gilgit Baltistan, those high-altitude areas, were perfect for that. They could watch what was happening in Tajikistan and Xinjiang.
Right.
There's also the idea that some British strategists weren't too keen on Nehru's non-aligned stance and his leaning towards socialism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they might have figured Pakistan would be more on their side in the Cold War.
So it was all about who would be a better ally.
In a way, yeah.
And that brings us to the Cold War and Aksai Chin. How did the rise of communist China under Mao change things?
When Mao took over China and then signed that treaty with the Soviets in 1950, it really spooked the British and the Americans.
Yeah.
It was like this giant communist bloc was forming across Eurasia, and Aksai Chin, the land connecting Xinjiang and Tibet, it became super important.
Right, a strategic link.
Exactly. The Western powers were worried the Soviets would use it to support Mao, to control resources, maybe even set up military bases.
So the stakes got even higher.
They did. And Gilgit, it stayed crucial for intelligence gathering.
Still that listening post.
Even after Pakistan took control, British officers stayed on for a bit, and those high-altitude outposts, they were still valuable.
For what, exactly?
They could monitor what the Soviets were doing in Tajikistan and Xinjiang, signals intelligence, intercepting communications, human intelligence, talking to local tribes who moved back and forth across the borders.
Oh, like spies.
In a way, yeah, they knew what was going on. And the British, before the Americans started flying those U-2 spy planes in the late 50s, they were even doing some reconnaissance flights themselves over Xinjiang and Aksai Chin.
Really? What kind of planes?
They used Canberra bombers, adapted for reconnaissance, trying to get a sense of what the Soviets and Chinese were up to.
Risky business.
Definitely. And, the British had done some geological surveys in the region before 47.
And what did they find?
They found signs of mineral wealth in Aksai Chin, particularly uranium. By the mid-50s, though, the Americans took over the aerial reconnaissance with their U-2s, flying from Peshawar. Much better intel than the British could get.
Okay.
And their reports confirmed that the Soviets were really active in Xinjiang. Airlifts, technical teams. And then in 1951, the Chinese started building that highway through Aksai Chin, connecting Xinjiang to Tibet.
That's the highway we're talking about.
That's the one. It made everyone really suspicious about what the Soviets and Chinese were planning together.
That brings us to the Sino-Soviet tango in Aksai Chin. It sounds like they were working pretty closely.
Yeah, they were. In 49 and 50, the Soviets flew a lot of PLA troops into Xinjiang.
PLA?
The People's Liberation Army, China's army.
Oh, right.
Stalin himself okayed it. They needed to secure the region, make sure Mao had control of his northwest border. It was a key step before they could build that highway.
So the highway was a joint project from the start.
It seems that way. The Soviets sent engineers, advisors, probably materials too. Building a highway in that terrain is no joke. High altitude, permafrost, really isolated.
What was Stalin thinking? Why go to all this trouble in a place India claimed?
He was thinking strategically. He saw several advantages to that highway.
Okay.
First, a stronger China meant a bigger buffer between the Soviet Union and the West. Second, it secured trade routes to Tibet, tying it closer to Beijing.
Makes sense.
And third, this is the big one, access to all those minerals in Xinjiang and Aksai Chin, including uranium. The Soviets needed it for their nuclear weapons program.
Right, the nuclear race was on.
It was, and this was all happening right when Mao visited Moscow in 49 and 50. Stalin pushed him to take control of Xinjiang and Tibet, even offered Soviet help to do it.
So it was all part of a grand plan.
It was. And the highway fit perfectly. The PLA did the hard work, the back-breaking labor, but Stalin made sure they had the support to get it done.
It's hard to believe the British didn't know what was going on, right?
It is. They had their people in Gilgit and Ladakh. By 57, when India finally found out about the highway, British intelligence almost certainly knew about those Soviet supply flights and the PLA troops. They must have suspected that the Soviets and Chinese were up to something, probably something involving uranium. And remember, the Soviets were desperate for uranium.
After their first atomic test.
Exactly, in 49. They needed to catch up to the Americans. And their geologists, working with the Chinese, they'd found uranium deposits in Xinjiang and Aksai Chin.
So Aksai Chin was right in the middle of it.
It was. And being so close to Soviet Tajikistan made it perfect for getting those resources out.
Meanwhile, India's in the dark.
Totally. While all this is happening, the Soviets flying in troops, the highway being built, the resource exploration, China's quietly moving into Aksai Chin. But India, they're focused on Pakistan after the partition.
Right. A lot going on.
And don't even realize what China's doing in this remote, empty part of their territory.
So the highway wasn't just a road. It was a way to solidify China's claim to Aksai Chin.
Exactly. And a way to get those resources out. Stalin got his uranium and his buffer state, and Mao got control of a strategically important territory.
And nobody told India?
Not until it was too late. Nehru, he seems to have misjudged China's ambitions. And then came the war in '62, and India lost Aksai Chin.
What a story.
It is. It's about power, resources, and, let's be honest, the race to build the most dangerous weapons the world had ever seen.
It's amazing how the great game just kept going, shifting players and ideologies.
Yeah, from Britain and Russia to the Soviets and China, always with Gilgit right in the center.
It's all connected, isn't it?
It is. The British worries about Russia, their control over Jammu and Kashmir, the lease, the double cross that put Pakistan in charge, then the Soviets and Chinese in Aksai Chin, all driven by a need for resources, especially uranium.
It shows how these seemingly small local events can have huge global consequences. And the British, their decisions back then are still impacting the region today.
Definitely. What they did, combined with the Cold War, it shaped the maps and the politics of South Asia as we know them. And Aksai Chin, still occupied by China. That's a direct result of those historical power games.
So the lines on the map, they're not just lines, they're scars, reminders of these power struggles, betrayals, and ambitions.
They are.
We've dug deep into this complex history, this strategic competition, the role of resources. It's been quite a journey.
It has.
But it raises a question for all of us. How do these same forces, strategic interests, the fight for resources, how are they shaping the world today?
That's the big question. What are the echoes of the great game we're seeing now all over the world?
That's something to think about.
Definitely.
That's all for today's deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time.
See you then.